Now let's come to paragraph 7. This paragraph 7 talks about breaches and the ratification of any breaches of the code. And there's a need to notify the MAS accordingly. Paragraph 7.2a talks about 3 business days after it becomes aware of any breach of this particular guideline. All right, and then notwithstanding paragraph 7.2a above, any breach as a result, any of the 1 to 5 given below there. All right, so if you take a look at it, then it talks about the appreciation or depreciation in the value of the scheme's underlying investment, redemption of units or payments made from the scheme, etc. Right? And of course, this need not be reported if it's been rectified in accordance with paragraph 7.1, right, but not later than 3 months from the date of the breach, unless otherwise specified in the particular code. All right, so there is a provision for ratification of any breach, but in any event, it should not enter into the transaction that will increase the extent of the breach. Now, paragraph 8, moving down, talks about recognized schemes and authorized schemes which fit into an underlying scheme. Does this regard to the disclosure of marketing material in doing so under paragraph A, 8.1. All right, this is related to feeding into another underlying scheme. Right? If that be the case, then there's a need for ongoing notification, and that's under paragraph 2, A and B. There's also timeline involved. You look at paragraph A, right, in terms of where the home financial supervisory authority of a recognized scheme or an underlying scheme which an authorized scheme fits into imposes or varies any condition or restriction in relation to its authorization. Right? Then the MA should be informed no later than 14 days after the condition or restriction has been imposed, or vary in the case of a recognized scheme, no later than 14 days after the responsible person of the authorized scheme which fits into an underlying scheme is notified of the condition or restriction imposed or varied. Right? And section 8.2b talks about the documentation of the scheme's risks. Right, in the revised documentation. Again, there's a timeline there, no later than 1 month. Okay. Then paragraph 9 talk about core investment requirements underlined for all authorized schemes. Right, just 9.1 quickly. All non-specialized authorized schemes, excluding property funds and hedge funds, are required to comply with the core investment requirements as set out in the Appendix 1 of this code. There are also requirements specific to money market funds, hedge funds, and capital guaranteed funds, index funds, and property funds, which have their own set of requirements. All right, underline their own set of requirements. All right, appendices 2 to 6 of the code, respectively. All right, it all depends on what kind of funds you are interested in. So look up the relative indexes. Then you can find that one that's most applicable to you. Right. Now, point 2 talk about only certain key core investment requirements are covered in this particular text, right? And A talks about impermissible investments, right? Under the box there, 1.1A, all the way down to F, right? So those are the permissible investments: transferable securities, money market instruments, eligible deposits, etc. Right, then follow that, there's some guidance given to you, right? The meaning of eligible deposit, right? Then coming down the page, requirements of transferable securities. Now this is something specific, 1.3A to D. All right, those are the requirements for transferable securities, right? And guidance is given below. And then down the page there, requirements on investment in other schemes. All right, so there you have it. Now then across the page, you can see there requirements of financial derivatives, right? So these are financial derivatives, and then it's set out under 1.6A, B, C, and D. All right, I just pause for a little while there. Just cast your eye down the page. all right, requirements for financial derivatives. Right. Then the 1.7 talks about OTC financial derivatives. This is over-the-counter derivatives, right? And 1.7 A to B gives you some of the details. Now look at B there quickly under paragraph B 9.4. Here it talks about the spread of investments, right? The spread of investments, right? So under the box at paragraph 2.1, single scheme limit and group limit, right, in terms of the spread. A scheme should comply with the following limits. Right? A, under investments in transferable securities or money market instruments issued by a single entity should not exceed 10% of the scheme's NAV. Right? This is a single entity limit. Right? Then B, aggregate investments in or exposure to a group of entities, right, through the same transferable securities, money market, eligible deposit, counterparty risk exposures using from the use of the OTC financial derivatives. Right? And for this B type of investments, to a group of entities should not exceed 20%. Right? 20% of the NAV's scheme's NAV. Right? That's a group limit. Right. For the purposes of this particular paragraph, a group of entities here refers to an entity, its subsidiaries, fellow subsidiaries, and its holding company. So it's in the aggregate. Right. Then 2.2 talks about short-term deposits, and that the group limit does not apply to the placement eligibility arising from A and B. Okay. So as I said earlier before, this is pretty technical. You need to understand the scope and the range of these provisions. All right, then look at the benchmark unit and the benchmark limit, and the benchmark limit is given to you at the back of this chapter 12. All right, and the benchmark limit is somewhere there. Yeah. All right. So under Annex 1A. All right, if I pause for a little while, look at the next one, that gives an illustration of the benchmark limit. All right, so due to time factor, I cannot run through the whole thing with you. But yeah, just take a pause and turn to Annex 1A at the back of this chapter 12, and you'll see how the benchmark limit works, right? Okay. Now, moving down the page, government and other public debt securities / money market instruments. The single entity limit of 10% may be raised to 35% of the scheme's NAV where A and B are satisfied, right? And 2.5 says that if there's a downgrade in the rating to that below the minimum rating as stated in paragraph 2.4a above, or if the rating agencies no longer rate the entity or the guarantor, the single entity limit should revert back to 10%. All right, that's 2.5 there as a caveat. And 2.6 says the single entity limit of 10% does not apply where A and B are met. Okay, in terms of the issuing entity or the trust, or the issue is guaranteed by either a government agency or supranational, by a government agency or supranational, and then the minimum long-term rating of AA by Fitch, AA by Moody's, or AA by Standard & Poor's, and except for the scheme with a fixed maturity, not more than 20% of the scheme's NAV may be invested in any single issue of transferable securities or money market instruments by the same entity or trust. Right? And 2.7 further says if there's a downgrade in the rating to that below the minimum rating as stated in paragraph 2.6a, right, look at 2.6a, or if the rating agencies no longer rate the entity or the guarantor, this single entity limit as prescribed should apply accordingly. Right? So, right, then after that, it talks about unrated and non-investment grade corporate debt securities. Right? It provides further information to that. Right. Okay, that covers the bit about the those particular products in terms of unrated and non-investment grade corporate debt securities. Now then we move on now to 2.10 commodity-backed debt securities. All right, this is another type of securities where the provisions are given. Now then you move down the page, you see concentration limit. 214A, a scheme should not invest in more than, this is concentration, right? It should not involve in more than 10% of the total outstanding shares or securities equivalent to shares of any single entity or trust. Right? They do not want over concentration. All right, or 10% of each individual issuance of debt securities of any single issue entity or trust, where such issuance is not part of a debt issuance program, or where debt securities are issued under a debt issuance program, 20% of each tranche subject to a level of 10% of the overall program size, and 10% of the money market instruments of a single issuing entity or trust. All right, so that's the concentration limit under this particular segment. Right, in terms of the spread of investment, single entity limit and group limit. All right, so I just repeat that. What we have been discussed is regard to the spread of investment, single entity limit and group limit. Right? Right, so the last point is about concentration limit. Right? To give you some provisions there. Okay, now very quickly then 3.1, we talk about global exposure. Global exposure. 3.1 says clearly global exposure of a scheme to financial derivatives, underline that one, or embedded financial derivatives should not exceed 100% of the scheme's NAV at all times. Right, that's the global exposure. Right, the manager should calculate the global exposure of a scheme based on two methods, essentially. One is the commitment approach or the value at risk approach, including any other variants of the value at risk approach, subject to prior consultation with the authority. In other words, you can use the commitment approach that is recommended or a value at risk approach. Any other variant of the VAR approach must be subject to prior consultation with the MAS. Right? So what is the commitment approach? Is there 3.3A2C. Right? So the commitment approach is set up there. And yeah. Okay. So then you have the netting arrangements, 3.4, 3.5A and B. Okay, now what we are talking about is in terms of the global exposure, right? The global exposure. And then following the hedging arrangements. Right, so hedging arrangements may be taken into account to reduce a scheme's exposure to financial derivatives on a global basis. All right, then the hedging arrangements are under 3.6, right, and 3.7 and 3.8. Right, the details are there. Right, then down the page you can see the value at risk approach or its variance. All right, and 3.11, I just read to you quickly. The manager may apply to the MAS to use the VAR approach, the value at risk approach, or its variant to calculate the global exposure of a scheme, instead of the commitment approach. All right, like I said earlier, the commitment approach is the recommended accepted approach. You may use the VAR approach or its variant, right? The global exposure of the scheme should also take into account exposures arising from the reinvestment of cash collateral. Right? So that's another issue there, where the cash collateral for the scheme has been reinvested. And there are certain requirements to be followed as well. Under 3.14A all the way to H. Okay. All right, so that's under 3.1 global exposure. Okay. All right. Now, under paragraph C, there use of financial derivatives, right? Now, under paragraph 9, in the box there under 4, use of financial derivatives, then again, it is the spread of the underlying assets that are key, right? Similar to what we have discussed earlier in terms of the spread, right? It should be sufficiently diversified, right, on a portfolio basis. This is to reduce the risk, right? All right, in the case 4.2, in the case where the underlying assets are transferable securities, money market instruments, eligible deposits, or units in other schemes, the limits in section 2 of this appendix, except for the concentration limits, apply. All right, for commodities, the limits in section 4 of appendix 5, index funds apply. Right, and the C indices under paragraph 4.2a, B of this index apply to each constituent of the index, where applicable, underline on a portfolio basis. All right, so that is how they will require you to follow the use of financial derivatives in the scheme. Okay, all right, the rest are quite self-explanatory in terms of 4.4, embedded derivatives, 4.5, A, B, and C. All right. Then very quickly, you look at 4.9, exposure to financial derivatives, the commitment approach, right? So 4.10 to 4.14 give you the calculation methods. Right, like I said earlier, I just want to repeat, this is a bit technical, so you need to take time to look at it, how to calculate, right? All right, so yeah, I'll leave you with that one. All right, and then you turn the page there, you can see how they do the calculation for you. All right, you need to take your time to understand the calculation methods in regard to financial derivatives. All right, under 4.9 all the way to 4.14, and then the illustration given to you. Now, very quickly looking at that table there, you can see the first column there is plain vanilla options under the heading of types of financial derivatives. And then the second column there, method of calculating exposure. Right? It's quite technical. Under bond option, that's what you have to do. Number of contracts times face value times underlying price times delta. Right? Currency option, you have contracts notional value of currency, leg times delta. Normally, when talk about currency, there are two legs, right? Base currency and the foreign currency. Right? There are normally two or more. Equity options, then index option, interest rate option, warrants and rights. Right? Then you look at the next one, futures. Bond futures, then number of contracts, times contracts notional value times market value of the future, or number of contracts and contracts notional value times market price of the cheapest bond to deliver, adjusted by a conversion factor. Okay, then currency futures, equity future, index future, interest, all very technical stuff. All right. Then down the page you can see commodity future. Swaps, different types of swaps, contracts for differences, credit default swap, currency swap, interest rate swap, total return swap, that type of forwards, forward rate arrangement, FX forward, etc. Right? So those are the calculation that we are looking at. All right. As I said, time does not permit me to go into the details of all this. So I just point you to where the relevant sections are. Right, very quickly look at D, counterparty of financial derivatives. Right. Now the counterparty of an OTC financial derivative should be subject to prudential supervision by a financial supervisory authority in its home jurisdiction. Right. Again, there are group limit, maximum exposure of the scheme to the counterparty of an OTC financial derivative. All right, and as you can see in 5.2. In the case of an eligible financial institution described in paragraph 5.3 below, 10% of the scheme's NAV, or in any other case, 5% of the scheme's NAV. Now, these are known as counterparty limits. All right. So 5.23 gives you the definition of an eligible financial institution. All right. And here you're looking at minimum long-term rating of A by Fitch, A by Moody's, A by Standard & Poor's, etc. All right. All right, and and then the calculation method at 5.5 as to how you calculate the exposure to a counterparty. Exposure to a counterparty of an OTC financial derivative should be calculated as follows. Stage 1, determine the current replacement cost of each OTC financial derivative by carrying out a valuation at market price. And step 2, derive the add-on factor by multiplying the notional principal amount on the market value of the underlying asset of the OTC financial derivative, whichever is more conservative, by the percentages in table 2 to reflect the potential credit risk. All right, so you're looking at the risk. So again, you can look at that table there: residual term interest rate contract, exchange rate contract, equity derivative contracts, and other contracts. They give you the percentages there. And then table 2, the add-on factors. All right, so again, those are quite technical, right? And you can look at it slowly at your own time. All right, then look at 5.6. The exposure to a counterparty may be construed as being lower if collateral is tendered to the scheme. And that's clear. If there's collateral, then of course the risk is lower. The collateral should meet the following requirements. A, mark to market daily. Now, this is another technical term. What's the meaning of mark to market? Liquid. B, C, taken into account on a portfolio basis. D, not issued by a counterparty or related corporations. Third party issuance. And then E, F, G, H, and I. So free from H is of course clear, free from all prior encumbrances. That means you can have your right fully protected there, and cannot be sold or given a security interest. So if there's a collateral, then the collateral requirements are set out under A to I. Okay. 5.7 tells you about what kind of collateral may be accepted. So it says the collateral may only consist of cash, or that's best. Some money market instruments or bonds, right? And again, for the purpose of 5.7, here we are talking about rating, all right? AAA by Fitch, etc. Right? And then notwithstanding paragraph 5.7, securitized debt instruments as well as money market instruments or bonds with embedded financial derivatives are not eligible as collateral. All right. So although we said that those are all right, money market instruments or bonds, but if these are embedded with financial derivatives, then answer is no, they are not eligible as collateral. Okay. All right. So the manager must have appropriate legal advice, right, to make sure that the collaterals are properly done, there are appropriate systems to document the collateral, and the collateral can be realized pretty easily, and under the law, legally, it can be realized, especially if the collateral is in a foreign jurisdiction. All right, so yeah. All right, then 5.12 talk about reinvestment of collateral. All right, collateral obtained in the form of cash by the scheme may be invested subject to the following requirements. Now, cash, of course, is a non-earning asset, right? So if they give you cash as collateral, then it is pretty wasteful to hold the cash in hand. So therefore, it may be reinvested for some returns subject to A, B, C, D, E, F. All right, so there's some conditions there in terms of a reinvestment of cash collateral. All right, then of course there's also under recognition of netting, that's 5.15. All right, in terms of netting arrangements between parties, right? The A to E talks about the netting. And just to summarize it, look at D, manager procedures in place to ensure the legal validity of the netting arrangement. Make sure that it's effective and it is applicable. Under review, and all possible changes in the relevant laws. All right, the laws may come in and say, look, the netting agreement is not enforceable, then you run into problems. All right, and especially E, draw your attention to it. Manager is reasonably satisfied that the netting arrangement is legally valid under the law of each of the relevant jurisdictions. All right, so when you have netting arrangements, make sure they are properly done. Then the next paragraph there talks about exchange traded financial derivatives. All right, under 5.6. All right, and especially 5.17. 5.16, sorry, 5.16 about financial derivatives, exchange traded financial derivatives, and 5.17, 5.17 talks about the margins. Right. Then paragraph E, very quickly, is the efficient portfolio management techniques. Okay, this is again pretty technical. It refers to the securities lending and repurchase transactions. Some of these techniques, right? And then counterparty, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and then 6.4. Right? In terms of the, this is called the EPM technique, EPM, efficient portfolio management techniques. How you can do about managing your scheme. Then 6.7, very quickly, we talk about recognition of collateral similar, right? And the guidances are given to you. Right. Then the next part is 6.11, talk about settlement. Right. This is in terms of this particular product, right? Right. Settlement. Then we talk about reinvestment of collateral again. Right. Now very quickly look at F. We talk about borrowings, whether the scheme can borrow. So answer 7.1, yes. You may borrow on a temporary basis for the purpose of meeting redemptions, all right, and bridging requirements, right? Some bridging requirements. All right, the scheme may only borrow from banks licensed under the Banking Act, finance companies under the Finance Company Act, etc. Right? Limit the 7.3 talks about borrowing period should not exceed 1 month, very short term. All right, for bridging requirements, tie over certain situations, or for the purpose of meeting redemptions. Now, 7.4 provides the limit. Aggregate borrowing for the purpose of paragraph 7.1 should not exceed 10% of the scheme's NAV at the time the borrowing is incurred, right? So there's some limit there. Credit balances, example, cash may not be offset against borrowings when determining the percentage of borrowing outstanding. So that's the guidance there. Then paragraph G talk about disclosure requirements. Right. So disclosure requirements is similar, especially when you're talking about schemes NAV with highly volatile due to investment policies or the portfolio management techniques. All right, especially when you're talking about this kind of high-risk product. A prominent statement drawing attention to this possibility should be included in the marketing material of the scheme.